Well, good day, everybody, and welcome back. Today we have another wonderful guest. We have the Honorable Preston Manning, who's going to join us to talk a little bit about sovereignty and Western alienation and some of the articles that he's most recently published with the Epoch Times and with the National Post. Mr. Manning really requires no introduction to my audience, but for those of you who may be unfamiliar, graduated with, a Bachelor of Economics back before I was even born, Mr. Manning, not to make you feel old, but in 1964, before I wasn't even born yet. It was another 8 years before I even came onto the scene. And, he's definitely well known and respected for his political career here in Alberta and the nation. He was the founder and the sole leader of the Reform Party. And he led that to become the official opposition. And he is the founder of the Manning Centre, now known as the Canada Strong and Free Network, as well as the Manning Foundation for Democratic Education, which promotes conservative ideas and principles and, of course, political networking. So, without further ado, thank you, Mr. Manning, so much for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't go through the whole resume because we'd be here all day.
Yeah.
A lifetime of accomplishment, a lifetime of experience. And I want to start today off with your commitment, as you put it, to truth and vigor. And, there's so much going on in the world today that revolve around ideologies and emotion. And sometimes we forget to dive into the facts. And a lot of people are not even willing to have the debate, the conversation today, which I think is part of the problem. So to have a conversation and, somebody like yourself to truly facilitate the fact that we need to have the discussions and bring things out into the open, I think is just remarkable. So with that in mind, I want to start today off with the fact that you single-handedly were the voice. I mean, I know you had help, but you were the voice for Western alienation in Canada for a long time, going back to the 80s and the 90s. Can you take us back to that time? And what were the things that you saw that led you to start the Reform Party? And then, in addition to that, what really has changed since then?
Well, that's a big question. I think the things that started the Reform Party, and of course, in a sense, people have to realize that Western Canada has a tradition of creating populist bottom-up movements and parties. The United Farmers of Alberta, United Farmers of Manitoba, United Farmers of Ontario, all of which formed governments. The depression parties of the CCF and Social Credit were bottom-up third parties. They were neither liberals nor conservatives, but they were bottom-up populist movements. And unlike many of these movements in other places, such as the United States, these movements actually became governments. So you have examples of populism in power, not just populism as protest. And the Reform Party was in that tradition. In the late 1980s, there was increasing number of Western Canadians who were mad at both the traditional parties, the federal Liberals for the National Energy Program, which took billions of dollars worth of wealth from Alberta, particularly, and from Alberta producers, petroleum producers, and transferred it to the federal treasury and Eastern consumers. And then, so Westerners did the predictable thing. They voted for the other party, which in those days was the Progressive Conservatives under Brian Mulroney. But Mulroney was slow to eliminate the National Energy Program, and then he did a number of things, in particular transferring a contract from the company in Winnipeg that earned a particular big defense contract and transferring it to Montreal. So you had hundreds of thousands of Western Canadians mad and unsupportive of both the traditional parties. So that creates a vacuum, and the Reform Party ended up filling that and championing the position that the West had to look after its own interests better than they had been looked after under the traditional party regimes. And so that got reform going. Well, one of the big issues back then, of course, it's an issue today, was the federal finances. That the federal government was running deficits. It had no commitment to balancing the federal budget. And of course, Alberta, as one of the big wealth producing regions, was going to be taxed in order to try to balance the budget. And so there was a great interest in getting the federal budget balanced. That was one of the two main planks of the Reform Party, would have balanced the federal budget and greater and better representation of Western interests in Parliament. And we won we contested 72 ridings in the 1988 federal election. We didn't elect anybody. 11 of us finished second, including myself and Stephen Harper, who was a candidate in those days. But we won a by-election the next year. Deborah Gray, we got a foothold in the federal parliament. And we spent the next 4 to 5 years holding public meetings across the country and discussing a different agenda, the reform agenda, and trying to get support for it. And in 1992, there was this great referendum, constitutional referendum on the Meech Lake Accord. It was a national referendum. Referendum campaigns, you have to do almost all the same things that you would in election campaigns. You have to knock on doors, you have to have a position, you have to communicate it, you have spokespersons. And that referendum campaign provided a great training ground for the Reform Party's constituency associations and candidates. And so when the 1993 federal election came along, and I know I'm rambling on to a long history, that was the election in which the governing Progressive Conservative parties standing in the House of Commons went from 155 seats to two. It's been the greatest federal political defeat in the history of our country. And Reform and the Bloc ended up getting 106 seats. A third of the seats went to political parties, third parties that had not really existed in the prior election. And Reform got 54 of those, or 52 of those seats. And that started us on our adventures in the federal parliament. So that's a long rambling history, but that's part of Western Canada history, third parties.
A little bit of that rebellion in the West, and there has been Western alienation, and in particular, Alberta. Now, many people see this as very unpatriotic, that, to challenge the ideas of Canada. And I know you have defended that to be incorrect and a misleading sort of statement. And I would agree because I think, to make something better, to get to the truth of any matter, you have to bring the issues out into the open. Now, you have mentioned that reform many times, and thus in the name Reform Party. Now, that would imply that Canada can be fixed. I think a lot of people today really have come to think that we've tried that, been there, but you know, what haven't we done? So, I mean, that's the difference between what's changed between then and now, with respect to Ottawa and Western alienation and the grievances that we kind of are putting forward. And what haven't we tried? What haven't we done? What more could we do to reform Canada?
Well, there's a number of options out there, as you alluded to in your first remarks, in your current remarks. The basic reasons for Western alienation and discontent still exist and are even worse. Uh, the ignorance, indifference, and even hostility of the many of the media and academic and political elites in central Canada towards the concerns and aspirations of the West. Simply do not take them seriously. You sometimes even get the impression that they wish the West would leave, if only that could, they would leave the oil and gas behind. So the basic reasons for Western alienation continue. The institutional unfairness, the fact that our Constitution does not provide for effective regional representation in the Parliament. We have a crippled, unelected, ineffective Senate, and that this is a structural defect in constitution that alienates people in other parts of the country. Uh, the unwillingness to see the legitimacy of Western aspirations. West wants to develop natural resources, agriculture, energy, forestry, mining, and the fisheries. Sees these as fundamental building blocks of the Canadian and the Western economy, whereas the federal government has treated them, particularly under the Trudeau regime, as relics from the past and even environmental liability. So the root causes of Western alienation and discontent are still there, continue to fester, and there's absolutely nothing being done even to recognize them on the part of the federal government or the Liberal Party, let alone to rectify them. Now, to get to your question, what are the things that can be done? There's a number of options out there. One of them is secession, to secede, either to form an independent country or to secede to form an independent country, but to get into a closer association with the United States. There's people that are advocating that. There are several other options. Two-thirds of Albertans, for example, don't support the secession option. So what are the other options? Well, one of them you could call the list option. Premier Smith and Premier Moe of Saskatchewan have provided lists to the federal government. There's about 7 items on Premier Moe's list the last time I looked, and I think 9 on Premier Smith's list. These are items that the provincial governments are saying if the federal government would address these, it would reduce some of the discontent in Western Canada. And they include the well-recognized things. One is unobstructed access to markets and energy and transportation corridors from sea to sea to sea that would allow Western natural resources to get to market. These corridors have been obstructed by federal government regulation and lack of interest and lack of endeavor. The repealing federal legislation which authorizes federal intrusion into areas of provincial responsibility. The federal government has constantly intruded in areas of provincial responsibility. This has created a deterioration in federal-provincial relations, not just with the West or with Alberta, but with virtually every provincial government. And the federal government intrudes in the health sphere. It intrudes in the natural resources sphere, particularly by the Impact Assessment Act, the No Pipelines Act, a ban on tanker traffic on the Pacific coast. These are major factors. And one of the options is if these provincial governments have put forward lists. Here's things you could do, federal government. And if the federal government responded, so far it has not responded substantively. But if it were, that would be one way of reducing some of the Western discontent. Another option that's out there can be called the autonomy or the sovereignty option. This is basically taking the Quebec route, where you take every area where the Constitution assigns constitutional responsibility to the provincial governments, and you beef up the provincial presence and action in that area just as much as you can, still within the federation. So this is not a separation option, but it's a sovereignty option. Quebec is pushing it further than anybody else, but the West could do the same thing. There was recently a report, the Rousseau-Proulx report, given to the Quebec National Assembly by a committee established by the current government that has 42 recommendations for beefing up provincial sovereignty in the areas currently assigned to it by the Constitution. So that's a second option. So, but then the third option is the secession option, with the two branches either secede to form a independent country or secede to form a country with the intent of a closer relationship with the United States. And these are the options that need to be communicated and discussed and debated. And at some point, some decisions made as to which of these options do you pursue.
There's a lot to unpack there. So I'm going to start at the beginning because is the movement to see a separate Alberta as a separate nation? Is it just simply economic? That is the one thing I think that COVID and other issues that have really brought to the limelight. I think Albertans in particular have a set of values that are very different from those in the East. So, you have brought up in the past issues of unity, and I don't see Canada as a unified country, and I've never seen it as a unified country. We have nations within nations. You brought up Quebec, for example. Our Indigenous populations all have special interests, all have special privileges. It's not one rule of law that applies to everybody. So, if we were to look at the structural, foundational kind of perspective of what Confederation, was supposed to be, I don't think Canada's broken. I think Canada's working exactly as you pointed out, as it was intended. And Alberta was truly that resource colony. So, how do you fix some of those structural, foundational issues? Because I don't think, reopening the Constitution, Quebec is definitely not going to have any part of that. A democracy is 51% rules the other 49. And in this particular case, that's to Alberta's disadvantage because Ontario and Quebec will always be that 51%. So, would not a republic, for example, of Alberta, serve much better than this democratic Westminster system that we have under Confederation?
Well, there's a number of questions there, so maybe start with your first one. And one of the points that should be made, and this is consistently ignored by the Toronto-centric media, is that this Western discontent is far greater than Alberta. There's polls that have been taken on this. This Western alienation is as strong, or even stronger, some people would suggest, in Saskatchewan. You just don't hear about it as much, but it's just as real. It's just as real in much of rural Manitoba. And it's just as real in much of British Columbia, all of central, southern, eastern, and northern British Columbia. Discontent over the same issues, all except Vancouver and Victoria on the west coast. So, for one thing, this is far broader than Alberta. And central Canada's got to understand that this, if you include the territories, the northern territories, this northwestern region constitutes half of the physical area of the country and consists of a third of its population. This is not some little thing that you can confine to Alberta. It's much broader than that. And so there's that aspect. The second point, and then I'll come back to your last point in a minute, that this is just oil and gas. One of the stupidest statements that was made by the leader of the Bloc Québécois during or just after the federal election was that Alberta virtually said Alberta had no culture, it was just oil and gas. You really wonder, has this guy never been further west than Gatineau? No idea that Western Canada is far more than that. It was far more than that before oil and gas was ever discovered at Leduc, that it has an ethic of freedom. It's interesting and it's worrisome that the current prime minister, Mr. Carney, wrote this huge book on values, and I think it's 535 pages long. He lists what he considers the most important values and the values that give value to society and certain things in it. In that list of values, there's one value missing. And guess what it is? Freedom. It's not mentioned in that list of values. And that is part of the essence of Western Canada's culture. Many of the people that came here, but this is long before our generation. They came here to get that kind of freedom that they didn't have in the countries they came from, including England and France. So the Western ethic is far bigger than Alberta, and it's much more than just an economic ethic. It's a broader cultural ethic centered around personal and private sector freedom. And then there's a third aspect of the Western perspective. Where has the prime minister gone outside of the country besides going to Washington in the last X months? to Europe, back and forth to Europe. Western Canada looks west, not east. It looks at the Asia Pacific region. It sees the West as the gateway to the Asia Pacific region, which is going to be one of the dominant economic regions in the future. It's not looking back to Europe. The idea, the Prime Minister stood on the corner of the main streets in Edmonton and Calgary and said, this is a sort of a European nation. People would say, you better lock the guy up. He's crazy. That does not describe this part of the country. This part of the country looks west, not east, looks to the Asia Pacific region. So I guess what I'm saying, Nadine, is that in response to your first questions, this discontent is far broader than Alberta, and that's why it's a national problem. And the Western aspirations and concerns are you will not satisfy them by simply building a pipeline. They're much broader than that, and that should be recognized.
So you bring up some
Now,
really good points here for Alberta separation. I look at what is being done, and I'm trying to be very realistic about the probability of change happening within Canada. And I mean, we have lots of history as hindsight to indicate that that change that Albertans are truly seeking is not possible, in my opinion, with reform. We've tried that path for decades and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. My concern, Mr. Manning, honestly, is for the future. It is not for me, it is for my daughter, who is now 14 years old, and the opportunities that, are ahead of her. And what I see is Canada has taken on this very Marxist, very socialist agenda. I don't see that reversing that trend anytime soon, which is, I find, very disconcerting. And it's not just an economic problem. Building another pipeline is not going to serve Albertans, I don't think, who are truly dedicated to this sovereignty movement. Because I think it is about freedom. I think we are overtaxed, overregulated. We're being told what to do, when to do, how to do by an surveillance state. And I think that is just as much a problem. Now, you've already identified Mr. Carney was very clear. He wrote a book. I read it called Values. Oh my Lord. And he made it very evident where he stands on all these issues. I think trying to align Canada with Europe is his last ditch attempt for the globalists to keep control, to keep us in this Westminster system. Whereas I think right now you're seeing in the United States, they're trying to shake some of that off. And I think Alberta, being an oil and gas natural resource, we're more closely tied with the West and our southern neighbors than we are with anybody in Ottawa. And I don't think that there is a path forward to resolve some of those cultural value issues. Am I incorrect in saying that?
well, yeah, let's get into that. First of all, as I say, this is broader than Alberta. If you even want to talk about separation, if you want separation as a threat to Canada, just Alberta doing it isn't a big enough threat. Western Canada separating half the area of the country, a third of the population, that's a threat. So this thing's got to be broader than Alberta. Secondly, you have to face the reality that at present, two-thirds of Albertans, at least, and I think it would be a higher percentage in the other Western provinces, do not support secession. They want to see something else done. And I say the two big options are this list option and this sovereignty option. So the people that want secession have got a big job ahead of them to convince a whole bunch of other people that that's the way to go. But let's take a look at that option then more specifically. Quebec is likely to go down that route faster than Western Canada. These Western secessionists that pay no attention to what's gone in Quebec. Quebec has spent millions of dollars on trying to pursue this option, on trying to think it all through legally, economically, politically, culturally, far more than the West. So at least we ought to pay attention to what's happening there. What's happening in Quebec, according to the polls right now, is that the current government, unless it does something dramatic, and maybe it'll do that, will be replaced before November of next year by the Parti Québécois. And the number one plank in its platform is to have another referendum on secession. And a lot more work has gone on to have that secession and getting support for it than in Alberta. So I believe Quebec, if anybody goes down that route, it'll be Quebec first. So now let's look at what actually happens. So suppose some province, I think it would be Quebec first, but could be the West. Suppose some province gets a clear majority of its citizens to vote yes on a clear question of secession. This requirement for a clear majority and a clear question is what's the essence of the Clarity Act passed by the federal parliament and interpreted by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, and the statute says, if some province can get a clear majority, and that's the word, of its citizens to support a clear question on secession, then what happens? A lot of sovereigntists think that then you could just waltz off into independence land. That's not what happens at all. What happens is that triggers a major federal provincial conference in which the federal government is obligated to negotiate, these again Supreme Court words, in good faith with the province that wants to secede and in accordance with certain principles. That would then if some deal is worked out, that would then require major constitutional amendments in which every province is going to have a say. You can't amend the current constitution without 7 of the provinces having 50% of the population being in agreement with it. So that's what would actually happen. Now, maybe under those circumstances, I think it would be Quebec first before it would Alberta. What exactly would be the alternatives? Has Western Canada thought through what would Canada look like if Quebec left? What if you took the Canadian Constitution and took out every reference to Quebec or Lower Canada? What if the West replaced Quebec in that kind of a federation? The West got Quebec's 24 seats in the Senate. It got its 3 seats on the Supreme Court. It got the majority of its seats in the House of Commons allocated to Western Canada. Would that make any difference with respect to the West's desire to remain in that reconfederated Canada? These are the questions that will actually come up if some province could be Alberta, more likely to be Quebec, actually gets that clear majority support for that clear question. And basically what that'll do is crack open the current Constitution. The Constitution would have to be rewritten. And if that occurs, one of the things that the West should prepare for is what if the West could rewrite the Canadian Constitution? Has anybody thought of that? Do the sovereigntists have their alternative Canadian Constitution or even the Constitution for an independent Alberta? These are questions well worth thinking about because that's what would actually happen if some province gets to that point of a clear majority in favor of a clear question to secede.
Now, so I have thought a lot about that. What would it look like? And that's what has brought me to the conclusion, in my own opinion, that Alberta should actually separate. And the reason being, just to unpack a little bit of what you said here, you're talking about, well, if Quebec gets there first, I think Quebec is terrified that Alberta is going to get there first. I think that's why we're seeing the reignition here of the secession discussion in Quebec, because I
Well,
think,
Nadine, I wish that was the case, but your problem is Quebec couldn't care less about the rest of the country.
oh,
You see the statements made by their politicians. They know nothing about what's going on, let alone caring. But anyway, carry on, carry on.
I totally agree, but I think for Alberta to secede before Quebec did, I think would really be a rub for them. So, but with respect to that, um, let's talk about the healthcare, the education, taxation, all these things. When you talk about restructuring a new constitution through reform, I don't think that those are easy conversations, but I think with the luxury of hindsight and the ability to look around the world as to what countries are doing things better. I think there's a tremendous opportunity, to do that. I just don't see it as even an option to do under the current constitution in Canada. Now, there are lawyers who I've spoken with who would disagree that the Clarity Act is, and the provinces, once we get a clear question, have authority over Alberta. Because the way that they've interpreted it and the way that I have read it myself is that with a clear question and a clear majority, then what happens is, yes, they do have to come together, Canada, to negotiate the terms of Alberta's departure. So, in good faith, because now the majority of its citizens have already made the decision that a referendum to leave. So, the negotiation is not on reopening the Constitution, because the Constitution would no longer apply from a standpoint of we are bound to it. We are now unbound
Well,
by.
you'd get disagreement with that, Nadine. If these terms of negotiation required amendments to the Canadian Constitution, which they would have, they would not be legal unless there's amendments to the Constitution, which then gets you into this current amending formula. I think the place where this discussion can lead is what happens if someone actually does get a clear majority for a clear question, which Alberta's a long way away from. There's still two-thirds of citizens don't think that's the way to go. And these are not stupid people either. And these are not people that don't have an affection for Alberta or Western Canada. But suppose you do get to that, I think the furthest we can speculate at this stage would be that you'd get into this good faith negotiation, which would require some amendments to the current constitution. And this could be looked at as a positive development in the sense that it would crack open the Canadian Constitution. It would crack the thing open.
But
And
Mr.
the way
Manning, to interject there though, but if Alberta votes to leave, we're not coming into this as a bargaining chip, but actually votes to leave Canada. Those good faith negotiations are its terms of its departure, not terms of renegotiating or reforming the Constitution. So, what you're saying is that we wouldn't be able to leave, is that we would need the provinces and the Constitution to be amended for us to leave. I don't think that's accurate. I mean, we have.
Well, it depends. No, I think you would end up. What would be these terms of association? What would be these terms of negotiation? One of them, for example, would be that this independent West would insist on an energy transportation corridor to get its resources to market, particularly if Alberta was doing it alone, because it wouldn't have access to seaboard. So one of the conditions that would have to be negotiated would be getting this corridor. That in itself would require some constitutional amendments. So
um
I think that what would move this along, but not as far as you would like, would be to figure out what would be Alberta's position. Quebec is going to get there before Alberta, but take Alberta. What exactly would be Alberta's position when it got into that good faith negotiation?
yeah, well, and
It can't just be asking to leave. It's got to ask some other arrangements with the rest of Canada. So what would those be? The other thing that I haven't seen much on is surely the people that are talking about separation have read the American Constitution. The Fourth Amendment to the American Constitution has certain conditions that you have to meet if you're a territory wanting to join the United States. One of them is that you have to prove that you have a majority of your citizens in favor of doing it. This is where the sovereignty support in Alberta splits, because there's those that want to secede to form an independent country, period. And there are those that want to secede to perhaps become something like a 51st state. But that's the first condition you got to meet under the American Constitution, not our Constitution. People are talking about joining the United States. The second one is even more problematic. You have to have a constitutional convention that proves that your Constitution is a republic constitution. And that would require Alberta or whoever is seceding to do that. And that causes a whole bunch of problems. The main one being that Indigenous groups within Alberta, within the West, insist on maintaining a relationship to the Crown, which is not a Republican constitution. It's got something else in it. That would be unacceptable to the Americans under their constitution. So it is not just a question of what constitutional arrangements would have to change in Canada to facilitate somebody leaving. There's the whole question of what other conditions would you have to meet to be acceptable to the United States as a territory. The U.S., would not be a lot of enthusiasm in the current Senate for an addition like Alberta or Canada, particularly if it got two senators. And which way would they tip in the current Senate, where the division is so close? So there's a lot of questions that these are unanswered questions. But to summarize, I'd put them in two categories. I think one should think through exactly what would be the uh, the terms of negotiation as required by the Clarity Act if somebody did get a clear majority and on a clear question. What would be the bargaining position? What if it's Alberta, or what would be Quebec? What would be looking for, and what would it require on the part of Canada to comply with it? Would it require constitutional amendments? I think it would, which makes it even more complicated. But that's where that would be a healthy discussion, and that's why one of the options to be considered is the secession options, and the pros and the cons of it. The other aspect is particularly for those that want to see secession to enter into some kind of union with their closer relationship with the United States, is to think through the constitutional ramifications of that. And these are questions that have not really been well answered, but they may well be debated. If I was to put this in its broadest context, I think what the discussion that needs to occur in this has to be broader than Alberta. These people that say it's just Alberta are not thinking big enough. But it has to look at the three major options. One is this list approach. Will it actually lead to some substantive changes? I think there's a lot of skepticism about that, but that's the approach that the current provincial governments are taking. Is there merit in going this autonomy, sovereignty route, which can be done with the list approach? And that is to beef up provincial action and jurisdiction in every single area that the current constitution gives to the provinces. This would include a demand that the federal government pass legislation reducing the intrusiveness of its involvement in areas like natural resources, health, municipal governments, and civil liberties. And then the third set of options would be the secession option, with its two branches: independence to form a completely independent country, independence to enter into some association with the United States. Those are the big options. And shows like yours, Nadine, helping people to understand those and to think them through. What would be the questions if you had, suppose you had Premier Moe and Premier Smith on your show, and they went through what their lists are. Premier wrote a 5-page letter to the Prime Minister listing these things out. But some of the questions would be, if you had to prioritize, she had 9 items, and Scott Moe had 7, I think. If you had to prioritize those, what would be the top 3, the ones that would really be a test of whether the federal government's responding? Is there a deadline on these, that there has to be action by such and such a date, or we'll assume that there isn't? And then the big question for those premiers would be, what if the response to the list option is not good enough? What then? That'd be a good question then. On this autonomy, sovereignty option, that would be a question: is should Alberta do the same things that Quebec? Quebec is doing even more to beef up its jurisdiction in every single area. It's going to have a Quebec Charter of Rights. That's its equivalent of the Canadian Charter. Should Western provinces have something like that? There's 42 recommendations for beefing up everything. Quebec is getting as close to the edge of sovereignty without going over the edge as you can get. Is there merit in doing that? Should there be an alliance The premier did talk at one point about an autonomy alliance, because this is an area where Quebec and the West, despite all the differences, are on the same wavelength. They both want a more decentralized federation, should there be more of an alliance there. Timing wise, what if the West's initiative on even a secession question occurred at roughly the same time as the Quebec referendum? Can you imagine the pressure that would put on the federal government, which is unprepared to deal with either bottom up populism in Quebec or bottom up populism in the West? Is that something that should be thought through? There could be questions about that. And then the third option, the secession option, there's these questions that could clarify it and the possibilities, such as we've talked about. That third option could, or that third, if it's the fourth option, I guess, could almost be considered reconfederation. If the West could lead reconfederation, would it be more content within the country? These are big questions beyond. I don't think I'll be around when these are satisfied, but they need to be thought through, and not just by interest groups. At the end of the day, these big referendums have to carry the judgment of ordinary folks. A lot of folks that have not thought these things through and say, what's this got to do with me? My main concerns right now are cost of living and crime and so forth. But shows like yours serve a purpose by raising the issues, but more than that, even raising questions. Maybe there aren't good answers to some of these questions, but at least they're put forward and provide grounds for further discussion.
Well, one of the things that I've done is and you're probably the first to hear this publicly, is I have actually written a book. And the book is about stimulating thought. It is about stimulating friends and family to have conversations that discuss exactly these issues: healthcare, education, taxation, reforming government, not just Alberta. But I think
Yeah.
we look around the world and we see some of the faults and the mistakes that have been made, and how do we correct these? I think we see bigger government, less freedom. And as somebody who respects freedom and is willing to accept the personal responsibility that comes with that, I think that's a conversation that needs to be had again.
Yep.
And people need to
Yep.
start looking at, okay, I want more freedom, but am I willing to accept the personal responsibility that comes with it? And what does that mean? What does that look like? Now, you talk about West, and we're not thinking
Or
big
just
and
before you leave that, Nadine, what's the title of the book? Have you got a title or?
I do. It's called Alberta Rising, and then it has a
Okay.
little subtitle, a little
Yeah.
trendy, a little populist. It kind of goes along
Yeah.
with what the things we're saying today. I hope to have it published and out here in September. And it is.
Okay.
It starts each chapter with a quote. And then it gets
Okay.
people to think about, well, do I agree with the statement in the quote by some of the best, economists, the best philosophical thinkers, the best politicians that the world has seen, going way back generations. And I'm more of a libertarian myself, and so I have studied Friedman and Hayek, and read Ayn Rand. And we have to start thinking about not the because it's the status quo, because I think every Albertan will agree that the status quo is not acceptable. I think that's something where you will get 90% of Albertans who agree that the status quo is not acceptable. And
Well,
personally, I
just while you're on that, Nadine, one of the suggestions that Ted Morton has made, and he's thought a lot about these questions and is qualified to talk about them, is that when there comes to be a referendum, there ought to be two questions, not one. And the first one is on that point that you made. Are you satisfied with the status quo? Yes or no? And then the second question would be, okay, if you're dissatisfied, here's the three options that you can that could be taken. Which one do you favor? But he starts with that same point as you do. One other point that's maybe not well, I think it is relevant to this discussion, and my generation and yours to some extent have always discussed politics in terms of left, right, center, left, right, center. These guys are right, these guys are left, these guys are in the middle trying to get the best of both worlds. And my view is that that lens for looking at the political spectrum is uh, cloudy. In fact, is becoming wrong. That there's another axis to look at current politics, and that's not this left, right, center one. It's a vertical one. It's bottom up populist democratic movements versus parties dominated by aristocratic elites. That's the new axis. And there's no part of North America that has had more experience with these bottom up movements and ones that became governments, not just protests, than Western Canada. And there's lessons to be learned from that. And all over the world, like in Europe today, there's these bottom up movements. In Britain, this Reform UK, which was hardly organized a few months ago, is leading in the poll. People's saying that we don't like the other alternative, so they're going to this. So that whatever changes we talk about, or whatever political politics we talk about in the future, I think has to take into account this prominence of the vertical axis between democratic populism versus aristocratic elitism is a more dominant thing than the old left, right, center. And right now, many of these bottom up things are characterized by the media as right wing extremists. If they're right of center, it's because the elites that they are a reaction to are left of center. If Obama and Biden had been right of center, this bottom up movement in the United States would probably have elected Bernie Sanders instead of Trump. But the key dynamic there is these bottom up populist movements, and how can they be harnessed to providing better government? So these things can go sideways. These bottom up populist movements, they're not guaranteed to be beneficial. But say Western Canada's had experience where these bottom up things accomplished major positive achievements. The first the first woman to get elected to an assembly in the British Empire was Louise McKinney to the Alberta legislature in 1918. And what party did she run for? She didn't run for a party. She ran for the nonpartisan league and got herself elected. Agnes Campbell McPhail, the first woman to the federal parliament, was not elected as a liberal or conservative. She was elected as one of the progressives from the farmers movement. These bottom up things, properly handled, can have positive accomplishments. Whether you agree with Medicare or not, the Medicare system originated by a populist party in Saskatchewan, the CCF. The management of a resource boom, which has been a disaster politically in most states where it occurred. In most states in the US where there was a resource boom, it got corrupted right at the beginning. The party in power got corrupted. Texas, Oklahoma, Alaska, California, the list goes on and on. In Alberta, it didn't. And it was a populist government that was in charge of managing that resource development. So I maybe getting off topic a little bit, but I do think this is this vertical dimension is the dimension of the politics of the future, and how to harness that bottom-up democratic energy in such a way that it accomplishes constructive developments, not destructive. That's a number one question for people who are going to be involved in politics to consider.
I think it's a
Anyway,
very good point because I don't think it is a left versus right. I mean, if Alberta were to separate, I think all Albertans would agree we want the best healthcare, we want the best structure of government, we all want the most freedom, we all want the least amount of taxation, we all want, the ability to develop our resources. And that's not a left versus right question. That's are you an Albertan and do you want the best for your children and the greatest opportunities? And that's why for me, I say I'm more libertarian, and people would say that that's right. I would say that that's as God intended, but it also comes with responsibilities that I have to be willing to accept. I'm responsible for my health. I'm responsible for, my personal circumstances. My opportunities need to be created. They're not given to me by a government. So, I definitely love the conversation and how it's going in that direction. Um,
and one of the questions there too, Nadine, like along with freedom is democracy. Like, are we in favor of democracy. That tradition was a democratic procedures where if you got a proposal for public policy, it's presented out to the public. There's a debate about it, and then at the end of the day, there's a vote on it. And if you're a Democrat, you agree to accept the result of the vote. And the hardest results to accept are the ones that go against your own position. And this is a test of a real Democrat. Will you accept the vote of the majority when it goes against your position as well as for it? And that's a thing that the pro-sovereigntist group will have to think through. Suppose you do have this referendum, as Quebec has had twice, and has put enormous resources into it, far more than has gone into the Alberta question, and they lost. And the last one, my worst night in Ottawa, I was in Ottawa as a member of parliament from 1993 to 2001. My worst night in federal politics was October 25th, 1995, when that referendum was taken in Quebec. And you had over 4.5 million people voted. Like, talk about interest in an issue. Over 90% turnout, which is the highest turnout in any referendum or election in Canada by far. And it came within, if 34,000 people had changed their mind on yes or no on sovereignty, that would have gone the other way. And the country would have cracked up. And in my view, the federal government at that time, the Chrétien government, in my view, was not prepared to how to handle that at all. But the interesting thing, that despite the passion behind that referendum in Quebec, Quebecers accepted that result. They accepted it even when it came so close, when they could have said, yeah, but the other guys paid for some of those votes, or they accepted it. And this, I think, this becomes a question for Albertans, whether they're pro-sovereigntist or not. If this did come to a genuine democratic discussion, back and forth, get the pros and cons out, and a vote on it, and the vote went the opposite way to what you wished, would you accept it? And of course, in democracy, accepting the vote that goes the opposite way, you can always say, well, we're going to try again. And
Hmm.
that's what did. The first referendum back in Levesque's day was defeated by, I forget what the margins were. I think it was almost 2/3 to 1/3. Then they tried again. They got it close to 49-51. The Parti Québécois insists that this next time it'll go over the hurdle. But they accepted to their credit, they accepted the result because they were Democrats as well as whatever else they were.
And that, I guess that's part of the question for me is, does Alberta or the West, does it want to be a democracy, or would it prefer to be a republic where, there's more individual sovereignty, more protection for the individual, not the 51%, dominating the other 49. Like I said, if we're going to remain in that system, Alberta will always negotiate from a place of weakness within Confederation because we are the 49. We are not the 51. That will remain
Yeah.
dominant in the
Although
East.
even on that, Nadine, if you look at the West population in relation to the rest of Canada is growing. Alberta is the principal destination for people that are moving from one province to another, particularly coming from Ontario, particularly people coming from British Columbia. They just consider the NDP a millstone around that province's neck. So again, depends on how long a future you look at. But if the West continues to have this increase in population, at some point it can dominate, particularly, or not dominate, but get a lot closer, particularly if Quebec were to leave.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I do agree there are a lot of people that are moving here for the values and they understand the hardship and the harm that's being caused by a lot of these socialist policies in BC and Ontario. But a lot of people have moved here too because of affordability and they're looking to retire and with that, oftentimes they're bringing some of these socialist policies with them. So I think that's a cautionary note on the new Alberta and who, the values that we choose to embrace. So, with that in mind, um, we have politicians, and this started with the firewall on, greater sovereignty within Canada, pension plans, police, taxation, collecting taxes. Why, in your opinion, Mr. Manning, has no premier ever taken the steps to actually implement any of these actions if we were sincere about doing it and moving us closer to that sovereignty, more of what Quebec has?
Well, a number of them has, and particularly Premier Smith has probably gone further in that direction than anybody else. The development of a independent police force, for example, is one that is being moved along. The petitions that they've presented to the federal government on this, getting the federal government out of areas of provincial jurisdiction, particularly on natural resources, is they've been very strong on pressing that. To get action on it requires action, of course, from the federal parliament, which they can't give. So I think there has been movement in that direction, maybe not as much as some people would like. The constraint is that a premier can't just decide to go in this direction on their own. They have to carry the judgment of at least 51% of their population, and that is difficult to get. For example, on this business of getting an Alberta pension plan, or getting out of the Canada pension plan and getting a strictly Alberta pension. The government has said they would prefer that, and they've produced all the information that indicate Albertans would be better off. But two-thirds of Albertans, and particularly the older generation, just simply are not convinced. Of course, they've been told that you'll lose your Canada pension plan and you'll lose in the course of it. So I think what partly constrains premiers from going any further than they have is the need to convince large numbers of people that that's the direction that they should go. This discussion on what are the major frustrations of um, what are the elements of Western discontent? What are the main options, the three or four of them, and which one is the best one for Alberta to pursue? That discussion and coming to some resolution on that would do more to move us along in one direction than the other than just endlessly debating it or just endlessly asking the federal government for things that it's not prepared to give.
Absolutely. I totally agree. We have to get Albertans to start engaging with Albertans with questions. And as I ended my book, when I wrote, it was like, now I hand the pen over to you, saying that it's up for Albertans to decide what it is that they want. And for me, it's about greater independence, it's about greater freedom, it is about basically having to look at things from the bottom completely up, because I think that Canada is just completely off the rails. For 150 years, Alberta has been literally nothing but a resource to the east, and we've been mistreated, abused. And I'm from the east. I grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador, the last province to join Confederation. And boy, if in hindsight, looking back, if we could do it all over again, what would it look like? I mean, when I started the 1905 committee, that was exactly what I that was the purpose. If we could do it all over again, what would it look like? What would we demand from our government and or, from the people, and to ensure that we protected our freedoms? Our judiciary has become lawmakers, which is a mistake. That was a responsibility that parliamentarians abdicated, I think, in the 1982 Constitution. So many things that need to be revisited and looked at. And with that in mind, can we agree?
Okay,
We'll leave it
we'll have to
on
wind
this
this up.
note.
We'll have to wind it up.
Can we agree that regardless of whether we want reform, regardless of whether we want sovereignty, regardless of whether we want a 51st state, if we want anything other than the status quo, can we agree, though, that that is a yes on a referendum vote for sovereignty? Because without it, we have no ability to negotiate. We'll never be invited to the big boy table in Ottawa without some actual strength behind, just words.
Well, no, I wouldn't agree to that proposition. What I would agree to is that if, as we've said, if some province does convince a majority of its people to support secession and a clear question on secession, it's going to crack open the Canadian Constitution, which will create a number of possibilities. Possibilities for the West, possibilities for Quebec, possibilities for the other provinces. I think that is what would happen if you got that clear majority on a clear question. And where that would end, maybe that's a discussion for another day. Whether Newfoundland and Labrador, what they would do in that circumstance would be an interesting question, but let's not get into that today.
But should Alberta not be the province to crack that open and to force the conversation? That would be that yes on that
Well,
referendum.
either one, but you should look at what Quebec is doing. Quebec has spent far more time and energy on this. They're likely to have a change of government before November of this year, and that government's going to have this question, and that this is a government pushing it, not interest groups pushing it. So I think if this issue is to be brought to a head, it'll be done by Quebec, but there'll be a lot of interest and even support for that in Western Canada as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Mr. Manning, for your time today. And I did my best, folks, to try and convince him on that 51%
Yeah,
on a question on
yeah,
a yes referendum. I'll get you to
yeah,
say it
yeah.
one day. I promise.
Okay, okay. Well, thank you, Nadine. Good to visit with you and with your viewers.
Very welcome. There you have it, everybody. I think a great conversation with the Honorable Preston Manning. Some food for thought there, things to think about. If you like this video, please do hit that like button, subscribe. If you'd like to see more content like this, please consider donating if the means are there. And God bless you all.